Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our studies of 1 Kings. Today we're in 1 Kings chapter 14. We've been dealing for the last few chapters with Jeroboam and Rehoboam and the kingdom as it divides after the death of Solomon. And here we come to the conclusion of the accounts of those two individuals. Now, we've heard far more about Jeroboam than we have about Rehoboam since 1 Kings chapter 12. But there's going to be some things about Rehoboam here in this chapter as well that we want to notice. But let's begin with the account that takes place at the beginning of the chapter in regards to Jeroboam. Jeroboam's son becomes ill. And when Jeroboam's son becomes ill, he is going to send his wife to the one place that he knows he can go to get an answer about what's going on. He's going to send her to a prophet of God. But because of his relationship with God, he is going to ask his wife to put on a disguise. Now, this disguise is intended to confuse or to throw off anybody who might see her and think otherwise or recognize that she was the wife of Jeroboam. But this is God we're talking about here. And it's interesting that he worries about this disguise with a man in Ahijah who is already blind from age. He can't see any way to begin with. And yet Jeroboam's wife is going to put on this disguise, and she is going to come before Ahijah. And before she can ever even speak, as she enters into the room, Ahijah greets her as the wife of Jeroboam. You see, God had already told him who was coming, and he had also told him the message that he was supposed to give her. You know, so many times people think even today that they can trick God, that they can fool God, that God doesn't see what's going on, or that they can get away with whatever is going on because God hasn't done anything to them yet. And yet we learn here in 1 Kings chapter 14 that trying to disguise oneself from God is not going to be any more successful than trying to hide oneself from God, because he knows all. And here Jeroboam's wife is going to do everything that she was asked to do, and yet at the same time it is not going to be worth anything in the overall scheme of how things are going to play out in this chapter. And so we see, first of all, the failure of the disguise. But you get a little later on into the chapter, and you also see that as a part of all of these things that God has to say through Ahijah, he is going to talk about Jeroboam's judgment. And he is going to talk to Jeroboam about, or to Jeroboam's wife, for her to give the message to Jeroboam about what is coming down the pike and why. Yes, this son is not going to recover from his sickness, but the judgment is going to come far deeper than that. If you recall going back to 1 Kings chapter 11, you have a situation where God told the future king Jeroboam that if he would be one who was willing to keep God's commandments, to keep God's statutes, to do what God said, then God would bless him and his kingdom would continue and thrive and prosper and all of these things. Jeroboam's done the exact opposite of that. Jeroboam has instead taken the things of the kingdom that he has been given and he has turned them to himself and has turned the people away from God instead of following after God. And so you have this judgment that comes down in verse 10 where God says, "Therefore, behold, I will bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam and will cut off from Jeroboam every male in Israel, bond and free. I will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam as one takes away refuse until it is all gone." And then in verse 14 he says, "Moreover, the Lord will raise up for himself a king over Israel who shall cut off the house of Jeroboam. This is the day." What? Even now. For the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. He will uproot Israel from this good land which he gave to their fathers, and will scatter them beyond the river, because they have made their wooden images, provoking the Lord to anger. God here says to Jeroboam, I'm going to cut off your house from the kingship. Now, if you recognize at the end of this chapter, Jeroboam's son is going to reign. He is going to take the throne. Not this son that was being discussed at the beginning of the chapter, but another of Jeroboam's sons. And yet at the same time, Jeroboam's legacy is not going to last for very long. And God ties it directly to the fact that Jeroboam failed to keep the commandments of God, and he broke the promises and the covenant that he had made with God. And so the judgment is going to come on Jeroboam, but judgment is also going to come upon the people of Israel, because the people of Israel have been so easily swayed. It's interesting that he calls them there a reed shaken in the water. They are so easily swayed by Jeroboam to turn away from God. One more thing I want us to notice in this particular chapter before we close. You drop down to the ending sections of the chapter beginning in verse 21, and you begin reading about Rehoboam. Now, you don't read a lot about Rehoboam after chapter 12, and there's several reasons for this. But Rehoboam is going to reign for 22 years in Judah. And yet, at the same time, Rehoboam is not going to have a legacy that is going to be really worth remembering. Rehoboam is going to be a weak king in many different ways. But I want you to notice that Judah is not in any better of a condition after the days of Rehoboam than Israel is after the days of Jeroboam. Because it is stated in verse 22 that Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they committed. They built for themselves high places, sacred pillars and wooden images on every high hill. So they're building all kinds of altars to false gods, and they're building all kinds of different things that step away from God as well. And even there's going to be levels of judgment for Rehoboam while he is still king. Because in the 5th year, the king of Egypt is going to come, and he's going to plunder the city of Jerusalem. And he's going to take away the treasures out of the house of the Lord, much of the gold and things of that nature that were in the house of the Lord. As a matter of fact, the gold shields that Solomon is going to make are going to be taken away. And something very interesting is said right after that, and that is that Rehoboam remakes shields, but he makes them out of bronze. Much of the wealth and the prosperity that was accumulated in the days of Solomon goes by the wayside in the days of Rehoboam, because Rehoboam does not have the wisdom that his father did, nor does he have the willingness to listen to advice and to act righteously as his father did. Now, his father was by no means perfect, as we see in 1 Kings chapter 11. But at the same time, Rehoboam is going to throw away much of what Solomon had built. These are some of the things that we find in 1 Kings chapter 14. I hope that they've been beneficial to you. We continue to traipse our way through the history of Israel when we come into chapter 15. And we'll be looking at several of the other kings of Israel and Judah and the things that the scripture has to say about them. Hope that you'll join us for that study. But until then, have a great day.